Okay, so I'm giving an update on OSL research projects. We've been underway for since September of 2020 in the field, and obviously planning for it prior to that. OSL stands for optically stimulated luminescence. It's a dating technique. Actually, there is another form of stimulated luminescence, infrared. And that's actually something we've ended up using more than the OSL because of the nature of the materials that we're dating here in the Northeast. All right, so sun structures in the Northeast are quite common. Common as mud is the way I put it. OSL allows us to date their construction. And this helps us know who did and did not build them. This is important because archaeologists here in the Northeast have generally just made the assumption that it was Europeans upon their arrival here that built all the stone structures we find in the woods, and that it was done for utilitarian purposes. Whereas OSL dating is proving that stone structures were here well before the arrival of the European colonists. Dr. Curtis Hoffman, in his 2018 book, Stone Prayers, really summarized his career's worth of research of Native American stone structures. And a very interesting table in that book, if you haven't seen it. It's of the 22 stone structures that he could find that had been dated along the eastern seaboard by radiocarbon or by OSL during a 44-year period. And one of the most interesting things was that all 22 of these structures were found to predate European colonization. But only 2 of these were dated by OSL, and they were both at the Upton Chamber site in Massachusetts. So it begs the question, why so few dates among the many thousands of candidate structures that can be dated by OSL? And can we use OSL as a common tool to learn more about these structures? So to give a little bit of background on the little bit of OSL work that has been done in the Northeast, this is a photograph of the Upton Chamber. That's Kathy Taylor holding the paper, and Dr. Fred Martin to the right, NEARA members that were instrumental in getting the OSL date at this site. And this started back in 2011 when the lintel, the entrance to the chamber, was partially collapsed, and it was going to be rebuilt, and it gave an opportunity to take samples from behind the walls as they were being rebuilt, sediment samples. And analysis was done by Shannon Mann at the USGS Luminescence Dating Laboratory in Denver, Colorado. Let me go back to that. So the date on there that they got out of 2 samples, they took 6, but out of the 2 samples that they actually had the funding to test at the time, 765 and 515 years old. So those were pre-contact dates. If you look at the bottom lower left diagram, the samples were taken by inserting a sample tube with a probe, and you can see the kind of locations where those samples were collected behind the wall to the left. And the picture on the right shows how that sample was actually inserted. The probe was inserted. So in 2018, a few years later, there was another project to do OSL dating here in New England. And it was a collaboration between the tribes and the USGS. And it turns out that the USGS has a tribal partnership coordinator, who Monique Fordham, who is a lawyer and member of the Abenaki tribe, working with Shannon Mann of the USGS Geological Lab in Denver, and Doug Harris, who many of us know, Deputy FIPO at the time for the Narragansett tribe. So these folks came out to New England and they did sampling of three thought to be Native American sites in New England, Pratt Hill in Massachusetts, which is literally within sight of the Upton Chamber and probably associated with it due to celestial alignments and such. The Toba site a little further west and north in Massachusetts, and then the Manitou Astronauts Preserve in Rhode Island, where I live. Now, this is a photograph of the double serpent Stone Row effigy at Manitou. The sample was actually taken a little bit off to the left of this photo, and it's an interesting structure in that it is basically stones on a ledge. So it's very difficult to get a good sample, but we did find a place where there was enough accumulated sediment that Shannon was able to provide a date. And I did not take any photographs during the time that we were actually doing the sampling, because it was kind of, let's kind of keep this quiet and get this done. And Doug Harris had pretty much asked me to, and I think it was at least a year later before I really started discussing what we had done. And so Shannon Mann, back at her laboratory, had written up her report, and being a bureaucratic system that the government works in, it was a little bit of time went by before the report was actually released to the public in 2020. If you can see over here to the right, the date ranges: Manitou Astronauts Preserve, pre-contact, Pratt Hill. One of them is 1490 to 1390 pre-contact. The other one is quite old, around 4,000 years old, 2700 BC. And then the Toba sites, two of those, first 1 and 2, overlap a little bit into the contact period, and 2 are clearly pre-contact. And in that same year, 2018, Norm Muller, longtime NEARA member and researcher, who's been involved off and on with the site in Pennsylvania, Oly Hills. He had reached out to Dr. James Feathers, University of Washington, regarding OSL dating, wanted to take a cobble from below the surface of a large stone structure there and date the cobble directly and not do a sediment sample. And so that sample was collected, sent off to the laboratory, and it generated a date range of approximately 2,500 years old. It was reported in the write-up was in the North American Archaeologist magazine. NEARA had done a write-up on it as well, and especially on that site, but at that time the NEARA publication came out, we did not yet have the date. So that's pretty much it for all the OSL research that's gone on for stone structures in the Northeast. So NEARA sort of made a decision we would like to date numerous additional sites. There's no reason we could think of not to, other than money. So the biggest question was, well, how do we narrow this down into the ones that we're going to sample? There are literally thousands and thousands of sites and structures that could be dated, and it would be great to get dates on all of them. So we started discussing this. We explored some of the sites, like we knew we wanted to get a sample someplace in Montville, Connecticut. And so we went out and did our research. Matter of fact, the picture to the right is Montville Souterrain, or the Huntsbrook Souterrain. And we, in fact, did go back and take a sample at that location. So the OSL team began meeting by Zoom weekly for several months. We established some criteria that would guide what we're going to do. I'll read through the list. This was going to be a research and a training project so that we would all learn more. We were going to have the experts with us. We wouldn't always have them in the future. We wanted to be sure that we went about the field research, field collection in the best way possible going into the future. We wanted to collect as many samples as possible and as many per site and day as possible. We wanted to address both Native American and diffusionist interests that exist within NEARA. We wanted to collect from a wide geographic distribution. We wanted to sample the diversity of stone structure types. We were pretty sticky that we were going to have written property owner permission for each one of these samples that we collected. And where we could, we wanted to partner for technical and financial assistance with other entities, and we have done that quite successfully. And we want to consider sites where the age determination might lead to preservation. And then, of course, use our ACE team of archaeologists, geochronologists, and geologists, along with our volunteers. And some of our volunteers, by the way, have tremendous skill sets, appropriate skill sets themselves. So our professional team, I'll call it, which is would be Vance Teedy, our archaeologist specializing in astroarchaeology. I know Vance has a great interest in a number of the chambers and things like the Newport Tower, as a for instance. Dr. Jim Feathers, archaeologist, University of Washington, supervised a lab, OSL lab there for several decades. And Maureen Fruin, archaeologist, OSL lab supervisor, who opened up a brand new OSL lab at Stony Brook University on Long Island this past year or so. So we sampled in Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Vermont. The picture on the right is right in my hometown. It's a recumbent Manitou at the end of a very low stone wall. And we did take a sample at that location of the sediment. These pictures show several different ways that we go about collecting our samples. Photo on the left, Jim and Maureen are inside a tent with a hole sliced out in the bottom, and they're on top of a large platform cairn, and they're removing enough cobbles to get down a foot and a half and collect a stone that has not been exposed to light since not long after the structure was constructed. That was an example of a structure where as big as that platform cairn was, it was all sitting on one big base boulder, and there was no way to get a sediment sample underneath the stones themselves. All we could do was get a sample under a base boulder, which wouldn't have anything to do with the archaeology date. So we collected that sample in the middle in a dark out condition. Dave Gutowski, he's going to be speaking later, is collecting a core sample. My description of this would be that it was roughly a 20-ton boulder sitting on a ledge. That boulder either had natural animal-like features, or it had been enhanced, or both. And it's associated apparently with alignments, celestial alignments. So it was an interesting structure, but a difficult to figure out how to get a sample. Dave put together this idea of there were some wedge stones between the bedrock and the large boulder, and we were able to wedge one of those out from behind there, flip it over to the side that would have been turned down away from any possible light, and Dave has cored out core samples that were shipped off to the laboratory. Stone was flipped back over and put back in the position that it had been in before. And on the right, Maureen Fruin that's a large cairn in New York State, in the Catskills. And this was a sediment sample taken with a trowel. At this point where you can see her, she's obviously not inside a dark out tent at this point. So I think what she was in the midst of doing here was inserting a dosimeter after the sample had been collected. And just a few pictures of some sites to the diversity of what we were doing. This is back at Oly Hills. We went back and took a second sample there. And it was a rock stone taken from the top of platform B. Here's a site in North Smithfield, Rhode Island. A very modest stone grouping, very small stones, size of a fist, and then this large quartz cobble that was standing up right there. We stripped away the vegetation at this point, and we're trying to figure out how to get a good sample here. Dr. Feathers came over to us and did a little bit of probing and looking, and he kind of just said, I'd forget this site, it's not going to work. You've got all these small stones. You don't have any large stones. And in a situation like this, the bioturbation of anything from chipmunk and voles to some animal digging for a grub or ants and worms and everything, many times over, probably the soil directly under these stones has been exposed to sunlight since this structure was built. So we would not be able to get a date that would reflect the stone structure. It would get a date that would be much more recent. So we reluctantly did not sample this site. This is Walker Quartz Cairn in Vermont. You can see it's a very large structure. We again took a sample down from the top. It's Norm Muller was here the day we took this sample, and he felt that it was very much related to a very similar stone structure in Oly Hills, both of which are large platform cairns that have trailing rock tails that come away from them, and he thinks they may both be related to the Adena culture of roughly 2,500 years ago. We'll find out when we get the date on this stone structure. And this photo was taken inside Richard's chamber in Vermont. That was this spring. It's a sample that was taken from a sediment sample from underneath the wall from inside. At this point, Vance is doing his documentation. You can see the orange flagging to the left. That's attached to a white PVC tube, and inside of that has been placed the dosimeter, which stays for 365 days and then is shipped off to the laboratory. This is Dave Gutowski's site again in Pennsylvania, where we're tinting over the cat stone here so we can get dark out condition for collecting our sample. This is our team on the day we were up at the Twin Column Chamber in Massachusetts. We collected samples at another site that same day. And this is at America's Stonehenge. Off to the upper right is main chamber that we were sampling, the Oracle Chamber. This is it's considered to be the Watchouts Chamber, and where we actually ended up being able to collect our sample is just about where those shovels are sitting underneath that wall. And this is earlier in the day up on top of the Oracle Chamber. That's an area that was backfill. We don't know if it was backfill the same day the chamber was built or whether it was backfill, dozens or hundreds of years later. But we did take a vertical sample with a tube right down into that material for dating purposes. And at this point, we're actually doing ground penetrating radar. That's Dennis Stone, the property owner, is leaning over looking at the display, and Dory Cuttribs and Sam McKenzie of Radio Solutions International is doing the ground penetrating radar at this point. This is back in North Smithfield, Rhode Island, and again, we've collected a sample in Vesnikinnik is a grad student, is placing a dosimeter after we've collected our sediment sample. So as a courtesy to us, back in June, 5 months ago, Dr. Feathers gave us some preliminary information because he knew we were anxious. And this was prior to any of the dosimeters from last September having been retrieved. Most of these samples were dated with IRSL. And for some, not all the dose rate measurements had been completed. But he was able to give us some very interesting dates. There's 10 samples here. The first one, the Madison lithic parasite, came out AD 1700 plus or minus 60. So that's really in the contact period. And that's the only one of these that really falls entirely or mostly within the contact period. And go back a moment, the lab numbers to the left, that's the tracking system we use. Those are assigned by Dr. Feathers. Then we just have a quick site feature description. It's easier to remember than the lab numbers. And then we have the dates. So if you look at these dates, they're practically all pre-contact dates. And again, this is preliminary. This will all be revised to some extent, but I'm pretty sure Dr. Feathers was comfortable that the trend is absolutely correct here. Then we had rocks that we were dating, and at this point, 5 months ago, Dr. Feathers had worked on 4 of the stones to date them. 2 of them at that point were ballpark 1600, and 2 of them had saturated signals, which meant that they were essentially useless to our purposes. One at Lewis Hollow and one at America's Stonehenge. Those saturated signals just indicate that at the time that those structures were built and those stones were used to build a structure, they did not get exposed sufficiently to daylight at that time to reset the signal, and therefore we're getting a much older date than the structure itself. And that's no use to us. That's a geological date, not an archaeological date. So the dosimeters are left in site in basically the hole where the sample is taken for 365 days. If you look at the photo to the right, Dr. Feathers brought 20 some odd dosimeters with him when he came out in early September of 2020. And then what's going on right here is that we're heating those dosimeters with a torch to reset them so that they're zeroed out before they get placed in the site. And so during that September phase, we collected 28 samples, so we didn't have quite enough dosimeters for every location. Since then, and thank you, Walter, Walter has acquired the correct materials and built the dosimeters to Dr. Feathers' specifications. And just for those that have an interest, the dosimeter consists of ultra pure copper tube filled with calcium sulfate doped with dysprosium, and then it's crimped and sealed with silver solder. And then you heat it high enough to reset and zero it out before you place it into the soil for 365 days. It will record the background radiation more efficiently, more correctly than the other methods, which give us a pretty good ballpark, but it's typically the best way to proceed. All of those September 2020 dosimeters are now at the lab. So we've collected a lot of samples. We have the sample that we're actually testing at the lab, and then we have all the backup samples that go with it. Such things as a bag with a soil sample that has, so we can gather what the moisture level is in the soil, because the wetter the soil is in the course of a year, the more that moisture absorbs radiation that otherwise would be collected in the sample. So we're taking rock chips at times, or picking up rocks nearby that might give off radiation at a different rate than the soil itself does. So we're trying to get all of the important stuff. And then, of course, we have the dosimeter. So we had somewhere way above 100 samples and subsamples that we had to get all packed together and labeled properly for the lab. And really what Jim Feathers is doing on the ground there to the right is going back through their field notebooks and being sure of how many individual packets were collected at each sample site. So that's done. We had one mistake where we lost a sample from Pennsylvania. Apologize for that. So successful project so far. We've collected 41 samples. We funded the 35 best samples. And this will be nearly doubling the stone structure dates on the eastern seaboard in just 1 year when this is completed. And most of the dates are pre-contact. Dr. Feathers will be doing continuing work with us. He will be publishing in a physical sciences and possibly an archaeological journal. He's going to be doing some future presentations. I was going to mention a couple of things. We're still working and studying to work with archaeologists such as Dr. Marie Fruin at her laboratory we visited this summer. We were have an ongoing effort to at the Newport Tower. I'm not going to go into that now, but we're hoping that we will be allowed to date the sediment from the backfill when the tower was built, which will give us a date the tower was constructed. And we've added Shannon Mann to our team for that particular project. It will be her lab that will do the OSL dating. We had a few technical issues. I've hit most of those. One of them, we have to use IRSL more than the OSL. I want to give you this. Our takeaway is that OSL Science is confirming that sites with thousands of stone structures in the Northeast are pre-contact. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harvey. That's a very interesting presentation. Lots of great details. We do have a couple of questions that come in. And so we have a 10-minute period set aside for questions. So let me ask the first question that has come along, and that is about the sampling of soil. The questioner says, when you are sampling soil, like for example, at the Double Serpent at MHP, which is on a ledge, perhaps the soil is more recent than the stone structures themselves. So why are we sampling soil instead of sampling the stone? Which would there be less accuracy in sampling the soil or more accuracy in sampling the stone?
Okay, good question. There was a scarcity of soil there, and it could well be that at least a good part of that drifted in. The sampling, the techniques that can be used where you can do single grain dating does allow for you to have a mixture of ages of soils and still be able to kind of zero in on the right date. And the other thing is that, there's cultural issues here too. I mean, we're talking about what I certainly consider to be Native American sites. And my friend Doug Harris, for instance, really doesn't want, there at Manitou, for instance, didn't want us disturbing these sites any more than we had to. And taking a soil sample underneath is generally considered to be less disturbing than taking a stone itself. So that's two parts of the thinking.
Thank you, Harvey. Now, another question, sort of a follow-up to, as you mentioned, a lot of these sites do have Native American cultural links. And what type of tribal interaction do you have in place when it comes time to actually dismantle anything like you described in some of your sampling procedures?
Okay, another good question. It depends on where we are. We were covering a large area, multiple states. When we were sampling in Pennsylvania, we had two people there that were basically representatives of the Lenape Nation. We did some prayer ceremonies and various things of that nature and involved them. We tried to do it where their comfort level was okay. It's a little strange in Pennsylvania because the tribes there were relocated to the Midwest, centuries ago, and they still have connections there. But anyway, it was just a little different than working where you actually have a local tribe and a reservation somewhere nearby. But that was an example of trying to work with the tribes on this. It certainly could use more thought and more solutions.
Right. And another question about the cost. What does it cost to actually do an OSL versus an IRSL?
We're paying the same price, $1,000 per sample. There's a lot of work that goes into this once it gets to the laboratory, and then it's all written up. My best understanding is that IRSL is a little complicated. So I assume that also means more time and therefore carrying more dollars.
Great. And now, when we were getting fairly small spread in the ages and a fairly recent age, does that suggest that the sampling has issues?
Again, I'm not the expert. When we have a presentation by Dr. Feathers or someone like that, that would be a better answer. What I gathered in general, if you do everything perfectly and you have wonderful samples, you can hope to get it to where the age that you come up with is plus or minus 7%. And if you look at some of those numbers in those tables, it was hovering closer to 15% or so. So you can't get a date that is meaningful and say that this structure was built on a Tuesday, in 1640. It's just it's not that accurate. There's too many variables that come into it. So you expect to have some variation, and we're trying to get into a ballpark age that is absolutely correct.
Okay. When you were doing the Oly Hills sampling, did you sample any stone as well as the soil?
At Oly Hills, it was a stone sample. The original dating that was done there in 2018 was a cobble taken by going down into the top of the massive stone structure, and the same thing was what we did in 2021.
Great. There's a question here that says, is NEARA getting any grants to cover the cost of doing this work?
We don't have grants yet. I've had people say, boy, if these results come out and we get a good report written up and everything, maybe that will be something that will happen. What we did do is we initially used NEARA money. We've raised something like $12,000 locally in matches to continue our efforts. So we've done some fundraising, that's for sure.
Okay. One question about the Montville souterrain was, how deep into the tunnel was the sample taken? I thought the tunnel and roof had been excavated and mapped in the past.
Repeat that last part.
The questioner says, I thought the tunnel and roof had been excavated and mapped in the past.
All right. We took two samples inside the tunnel. I'm trying to remember what we did. The first one was pretty far up, pretty much all the way in back into the largest where it expands out a little bit. That was I believe, a sediment sample underneath, and we also took a stone, I believe, from inside at the base. I'm working from memory. That's a bad thing. We attempted to take some samples up on the top, but we don't think we got deep enough to be, in contact with the roof slabs or something where we would have thought it would have been a contemporary date.
Okay. The original questioner has asked me to repeat the question verbatim. Apparently, I paraphrased it incorrectly. So this is verbatim her actual question. Have you gotten any tribal feedback of your dismantling of features? Question mark.
As feedback, no, I think we had discussions with them. We certainly, as I said, in Pennsylvania, we were working with tribal representatives that were actually part of the crew. Certainly welcome tribal participation. I mean, it varies. Sometimes it's us, and they don't seem to show the interest. And it's if somebody's got some ideas, we're delighted to have that, and particularly if they're tribal, be delighted to, because we want to do additional sampling. So we'd love to be doing it as a joint project as much as we can.
We got a question about what is optical luminescence, where does it come from, and how is it determined? Do you think that'd be better left for Dr. Feather's presentation, Harvey?
That's a whole lot better than my take on what it means. I tried to get very simple answers. When I see the reports that get written, where they, everything they do in the lab triggers some little thing that we do. So is our next step going to go to the right or to the left as far as which way they go down the chain of all the things you have to do to acquire a date? So it's on a technical level, it's very technical. All
right. Well, thank you very much for answering those questions, Harvey. We actually have a bunch more that have come in, but we have to cut off the question period at 10 minutes and we're there. So thank you for all your questions, and Harvey for all your answers, and for a great presentation, Harvey.
Thank you.